I'm Bill Gates, chairman of Microsoft. And in this video, you're going to see the future. Windows. Microsoft first came up with the Windows concept just 3 years ago in 1983, and today it has made incredible breakthroughs within the software space. Now we can take this Ferrari and paste it right into Windows Right. And watch how I can just switch between different programs like Windows Paint, Control Panel, Clock, DMS-DOS Executive. The list really just goes on and on. Now, how much do you think Microsoft Windows is worth? $500? $1,000? $1 million? Try a measly $99. It's an incredible value, but it's true. It's Windows from Microsoft. Order today, P.O. Box 286 DOS. Except in Nebraska.
Now, I don't need to really remind you of just the kind of impact that Microsoft Windows has had in our lives. It's everywhere we go and incorporated in places we wouldn't even expect. But of course, it all has to start somewhere. And the very first ever version, Windows 1.0, blessed computer screens around the world in 1985. Especially nowadays, all these features it boasted in its marketing and product design are, let's be honest, quite boring and really not that remarkable, showcasing just how far we've gone and how much we take for granted today. But funnily enough, these features weren't even that remarkable back in 1985. We often like to think of Windows as the pioneers of the computing sector, but at its launch, the product actually faced immense criticism for being nothing more than just a blatant ripoff of other operating systems at the time, particularly System 1 on the newly released Apple Macintosh, a ripoff that wasn't even as good, as it would also be ridiculed for its lackluster and at times unstable performance. But despite encountering all these bumps, Microsoft knew that they had something here, and that their value proposition for Windows was something truly special. Way too special to give up on right away. And today, we are going to tell that story. Now, everyone thinks that building a website is so easy and that the creators of YouTube, Google just got up and did it because it was just easy peasy lemon squeezy. But it's not. It's difficult, lemon difficult. Until now, thanks to Squarespace. Squarespace is a super user-friendly, customizable, hands-on website builder for anyone looking to personalize their online presence. Whether it's to start your own creative online business or express your creativity, Squarespace makes it both easy and fun. One of my favorite features is Fluid Engine. I always have these amazing concepts in my head for websites, but I never know where to start on making them. This feature gives me a template to work from, and then provides a step-by-step process for making it unique to me. You can also add a built-in store to your site, and Squarespace provides all the necessary tools for you to start selling online right away. And of course, if you want to see how your website is doing, the analytics page will tell you how much traffic you are getting, among other things. I truly love how easy and fun Squarespace is to use, especially for someone like me who really doesn't know how to code. And now you can get started building your website today. Head over to squarespace.com/nationsquid to save 10% off your first website or domain name purchase and start creating the website you've always wanted. Now, to someone with not a ton of knowledge within the tech space, the idea of Microsoft Windows showing up in the mid-1980s sounds almost anachronistic, like something completely ahead of its time, and understandably so. Windows didn't really enter the majority of American homes or even the minds of everyday people until around the 1990s, during the explosion of the internet. But you could say that none of that would have ever happened had the original Windows not been released at the time that it was, or even in the way that it was. Keep in mind, in comparison to today, personal computers in the 1980s were anything but personal. It wasn't as if anyone could just hop on and get acquainted with their new device within 10 minutes. Computers were sophisticated, complex machines, and the user already had to be quite familiar with them to perform basic tasks. This was because they were basically glorified calculators, where you literally just had a command line and you had to manually enter the commands for executing the tasks they wanted to perform. And even then, it had to be in the same programming language as the system you were running. So if you were trying to use a Commodore 64 and only knew Apple DOS, yeah, you were out of luck. So naturally, the popularity of computers with average people took some time to catch on. They either didn't have the time or patience to learn something new, or were simply too intimidated by them, knowing full well of their seemingly endless capabilities, but not really understanding them. If computers were going to succeed to the fullest of their potential, this had to change. Computers needed to be easier to use. And so, over the years, technology got better, incredible breakthroughs surfaced, and this goal was becoming closer to a reality. Since their conception, the evolution of computers has essentially gone through a series of waves. The first wave was when they showed up for the first time during World War II as huge thinking boxes the size of entire living rooms. They were known as mainframes and were mostly found in industrial settings. The second wave occurred during the 1970s, when computers were becoming personal. You could now fit them on a desk. And now in the 1980s, people were both working towards and anticipating the third wave in computing, where computers were not only personal, but easy to use and for everyone. But how are you going to accomplish that with something like this? And the top tech companies in the world were hyper aware of this problem, including a man named Steve Jobs, who claimed that Apple was currently working on the project that would officially start this third wave. But another company was also researching this, a company called Microcomputer Software, or Microsoft for short. And they had essentially created the stepping stone for this third wave with the massive success of a product known as Microsoft Disk Operating System, otherwise known as MS-DOS. It would become the system of choice for most IBM machines and was revered for its simplicity, wide range of hardware support, and its agility. Although its hold on the OS market share was overall small at this time, it was thanks to MS-DOS that Microsoft would make its way to the top and become one of the industry standards for many work environments. But that problem of user-friendliness was still there. MS-DOS was certainly an improvement, but it was still a command line operating system. Computers needed to be so easy to use that anyone, even those with no experience, could use them. In January of 1984, something amazing happened. Apple launched its revolutionary new computer, the Macintosh, and it tackled this exact issue. What if instead of typing complicated commands in an ugly command line to get basic tasks done, you instead had a pretty digital office, and all you had to do was just move this thing around and click, and then things would just happen for you. This technology was called a graphical user interface, or GUI for short, and the Macintosh was the first mainstream computer to commercially use one. Despite the Macintosh's complicated history, this feature was very influential, and it was clear that this would be the new standard for computing going forward. Command line operating systems were on the way out, which meant it was time for Microsoft to follow suit if they wanted to stay in the game. Perhaps it was time to make a GUI version of MS-DOS. Though Bill Gates had garnered interest for a GUI software before the Macintosh was even a thought, when he saw a demonstration of the Vision program at Comdex in 1982. And so Microsoft began working on a graphical overlay for MS-DOS called Interface Manager. On top of creating an easier, more organized environment, it also technically allowed for multitasking, as it would show multiple applications on the screen at once, each within their own little boxes. These little boxes were known in the tech industry as windows, and the programs that used them were called windowing systems. However, if Microsoft was going to contribute to this third wave of computing and making computers more familiar and easier to use, their product needed to have a name that was easy and familiar to remember. an interface manager was just not gonna cut it. I mean, come on, that's way too nerdy. And so in 1982, Microsoft hired Roland Hansen as the company's marketing VP to take on handling the project. And his idea was to create a name that had the word Microsoft in front of it, and then a word after it that was easy to remember. He noticed that the term window was very common within the tech lexicon, and so he thought, hey, why don't you guys just call it Microsoft Windows? Not only was it a simple word, now Microsoft would be on the minds of people who used a word that was so common within the computer world. And so they got straight to work on the Windows project. And on November 10th, 1983, the product was officially announced to the public. This is during a time where the Macintosh was still in its very primitive stages. In fact, Apple was working on an entirely different project at the time called the Apple Lisa, and this was meant to be their big project to include a GUI interface. In short, it was clear that this whole GUI trend was essentially an arms race within the tech community, and it was simply just a matter of who would come out with it first. The Macintosh would win that race, but its innovation showed that this GUI concept was a project worth pursuing and improving upon. Then, on November 20th, 1985, Windows 1.0 was released to manufacturing for the retail price of $99. And people just didn't really care that much? Yeah, Windows wasn't really met with a lot of excitement, and critics were pretty split on it. Many people thought that it was a total ripoff of the Macintosh, including Steve Jobs himself. Apparently, he was furious when he heard about the Windows project before it was even released, and would ultimately be what would start the whole Mac versus PC debacle that is still oh so common today. But you know what else was a blatant ripoff of the Macintosh? The Macintosh. Yeah, it wasn't exactly all that original either, like at all. The Macintosh may have been the first computer to make the GUI interface popular among everyday people, but it wasn't the first GUI machine ever, like most people thought. That credit would go to Xerox, who were the ones who ultimately perfected the concept. They had begun experimenting with it as far back as 1973. These computers were never commercially sold, but they were super ahead of the game, even to the Macintosh's standards. These computers even included emoticons in its word processing tools. Yes, you had emojis in the 1970s. Steve Jobs even saw the machines in person at Xerox PARC back in 1979, which gave him the idea in the first place. So really, all the Macintosh did was take this existing technology and watered it down to make it more compatible with weaker hardware that would be more affordable to everyday people, a lesson they had to learn the hard way with the Apple Lisa. But little did Jobs know that Bill Gates was also doing research on Xerox. According to Walter Isaacson, when asked about Jobs' reaction to Windows, Gates responded, "I think it's more like we both had this rich neighbor named Xerox, and I broke into his house to steal the TV set and found out that Jobs had already stolen it." You could make the argument that since Microsoft was already providing programs to the Macintosh like Word and Multiplan, a precursor to Excel, that they had a bit of an advantage in getting to assess the Macintosh's strengths and weaknesses and build onto them when creating Windows. But still, the sheer existence of the Macintosh showed that Silicon Valley was a dog-eat-dog world. So what great features did the first Windows provide?
Calculator. That's cool. Anything else?
Clock. A clock.
Sounds like hours of fun.
Yeah, in 1986, Windows just wasn't as popular, exciting, or even as capable as the Macintosh system was. That's because the first version of Windows wasn't really an operating system at all. It was more of an operating environment. It was more like a program that ran on top of MS-DOS to make it easier to use through a graphical interface. This was known as middleware. There are some benefits to having this. Anyone running Windows could always just go back to the DOS command line if they ever needed it. System 1 on the Macintosh, on the other hand, was a completely new operating system, not the Apple DOS that the Apple II ran. It had the disadvantage of being a lot more locked down and not having much support with Apple II programs. But the Macintosh had a completely separate goal in mind when it was being created, so Apple felt that this was irrelevant. Because of this, this, Windows just wasn't as beefy and robust as the operating system on the Macintosh. It was instead just a computer program. In fact, this was technically the case for all consumer versions of Windows until Windows XP in 2001, which would also incorporate the much more up-to-date NT kernel of Windows. I've done an entire video on that if you would like to check it out, but I digress. The point is, Windows had the right value proposition in mind to make the personal computer much easier to use, but having such a primitive and unsophisticated start after all the craze the Macintosh had just didn't give them the overnight success that they may have wanted. Having said that, Windows 1.0 introduced features we still see today. It included Notepad, Windows Write, Paint, Calculator, and even some games. One game in particular that the OS boasted was Reversey, which encouraged people to learn how to use a computer mouse. But again, these were essentially just derivations of programs already made by the Macintosh, but just not as good, and didn't even perform as good. One advantage the Macintosh had was that its performance was, while not perfect, more predictable. And this was because all Macintosh computers had more or less the same hardware, making issues much easier to diagnose. MS-DOS and Windows 1.0 could be installed on a variety of computers, and those who did not take note of its excessively heavy hardware requirements experienced a lot of problems. Arguably, the biggest problem was its setup for multitasking, which essentially allowed for multiple programs to run at the same time, which, depending on the hardware, would cause the entire system to crash. A critic from the New York Times even described the Windows experience as pouring molasses in the Arctic. And to add insult to injury, the marketing behind Windows was so lifeless. The Macintosh had a freaking Super Bowl commercial, and a powerful one at that. Not only did their commercials show the simplicity and attractiveness of using a Macintosh, it also was a huge jab at all the leading utilitarian computer companies of the time, like IBM. Macintosh was for the rebels, those who were sticking it to the man. It was the punk rock of computers. Not only did the first Windows have no confirmed commercials that ever aired, there is debate on if the famous Steve Ballmer one is even real, but the ads they did show were not exciting or memorable. It was an office program, and it felt like one. More of the same, more of what Apple was criticizing, but in GUI form. And it was for these reasons that Windows really just didn't seem worth it in 1985. Those who were already very experienced with computers were comfortable with MS-DOS and didn't mind its simplicity. Those who were just learning about computers for the first time were attracted by the warm personality and head start experience of the Macintosh, even if the price was considerably higher. And those in between were just not ready, and chose to wait a few more years to see if this whole computer thing would even take off. Although Windows flopped, Microsoft knew that it was not a project to let go of. MS-DOS was still hugely in the lead, but in order to keep that, it had to become easier to use over time and follow the trend the Macintosh set for consumers. Microsoft just knew that if they kept building on top of what they created, it would become worth it in the end eventually. And that is ultimately what happened. But you know what else helped Microsoft in the long term? Becoming a Patreon or channel member, of course. Just click join or go to patreon.com/nationsquid. Truly does wonders. A special thanks to my patrons and channel members for making this video possible.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and click the notification bell so that you never miss a future video.